19th of September 1944. The fog was thick that morning. It clung to the ground like a secret, hiding the sounds of war that were waiting just over the hills. General Elias Morrow stood alone near a broken fence, staring into the mist. His coat was muddy, his face unshaved for days, and his eyes wild with a strange kind of calm, the kind that made other officers call him crazy behind his back. His men were broken, scattered, and low on supplies. They had lost 2 towns in 3 days. German tanks had pushed hard into their zone, and no one believed they could hold them off anymore. Even the high command had stopped sending messages. They expected Morrow's unit to fall, that maybe by nightfall. But Morrow had something else in mind. 3 days earlier, when reports came in of advancing German divisions, the expected order was to dig in and hold ground. But Morrow did something unexpected. He ordered a full retreat, not chaotic but planned. His officers looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Some begged him to reconsider. Others thought he was surrendering without a fight. "Let them think we're running," he said, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. "Let them chase." And so the retreat began. Villages were left behind. Ammunition dumps were burned. Roads were blocked, not to stop the Germans, but to funnel them into certain paths. Morrow left behind small units to guide the enemy, not fight them. They used fake radios, staged wounded soldiers, and planted abandoned equipment to sell the illusion of panic. By the second day, the German divisions, 3 in total, were moving fast, confident, and a little too hungry. They believed they had broken the line, and to them a broken line meant easy victory. That night, in a hidden farmhouse on the edge of the Karsfeld woods, Morrow met with his senior officers. They were exhausted and unsure. Captain Royce asked the question everyone was thinking. "Sir, if we keep falling back, what's left to defend?" Morrow placed a map on the dusty table and pointed to a wide stretch of forest where 2 valleys met. "We're not defending," he said, smiling for the first time in days. "We're ambushing." The plan was mad. On paper it looked like suicide. But Morrow had studied the land for months. The Karsfeld Valley narrowed into a choke point. If the Germans took the bait, they'd be funneled into it, thinking they had cornered a dying unit. What they wouldn't see were the hundreds of troops hidden in the forests on both sides, artillery buried under brush, and anti-tank guns loaded and silent. By dawn, on 19th of September, the first German tanks rolled into the valley. Scouts reported that Morrow's forces were still running. The German commanders ordered a full advance. At 9:14 a.m., just as the last of the enemy vehicles entered the kill zone, Morrow gave the signal. A single flare shot into the sky. Hell opened. The sides of the valley lit up with fire. Anti-tank shells tore through steel. Infantry launched from hidden trenches. Machine guns cut into the German flanks with brutal accuracy. The sky filled with smoke, and the echo of explosions rolled like thunder across the hills. The Germans had no room to maneuver. The valley that looked like a gift turned into a grave. Morrow himself led the charge from the left hill, rifle in hand, shouting orders like a man possessed. He moved through the chaos with purpose, not like a general, but like a soldier who had everything to lose. By evening, the valley was silent again. 3 German divisions gone, their officers captured or killed. Tanks burning, bodies buried under rubble and trees. The retreat had been a mask, and the counterattack a masterpiece. That night, as his men buried the dead and gathered whatever supplies they could, General Elias Morrow sat alone again, staring at the burning sky. A medic approached him and said, "Sir," command just radioed in. "They want to know how you pulled this off." Morrow didn't look at him. He just muttered, "Tell them it was madness." And madness works. September 1944, nightfall. The smoke still hung in the air like a bitter memory. Ash floated down gently from the trees, landing on the helmets of tired soldiers who walked among twisted wreckage, searching for survivors, or what was left of them. General Elias Morrow stood beside a flipped German panzer tank, its hull still glowing faintly from the fire that had gutted it. His coat flapped in the wind, and though he was surrounded by chaos, his eyes remained sharp, locked on a radio operator running toward him through the muddy field. "Sir!" the young corporal shouted, skidding to a halt. Intercepted messages. The Germans know. They're regrouping, and they're furious. Morrow didn't react with fear. He actually smiled, his teeth catching the dying light. "Good," he said quietly. "Let them come." Across the valley, the wounded were being pulled into makeshift tents. Medics worked without pause, hands stained red, faces blank. They didn't ask questions anymore. Not about orders, not about outcomes. They followed Morrow because somehow, even when things seemed insane, he made it work. Captain Royce approached next, his uniform torn, face streaked with grime and blood, not his own. "We've confirmed 2 generals among the German dead," he said. This wasn't just any unit. These were elite panzer grenadiers. Goddamn Royal Guard types. "Then they died well," Morrow replied. He lit another cigarette, his 5th in an hour. His hands were shaking again. Not from nerves, but from something deeper. Something darker. The thing he didn't talk about. The thing that woke him at night. But he didn't let it show. Not to them. "Royce," he said after a pause, "we're not done." Royce blinked. "Sir, they'll send more. This wasn't their full hand. They underestimated us once. They won't make that mistake again. Which means we have 1 night to vanish. And I want every man ready to move by dawn." Royce hesitated, then nodded. He'd learned that arguing with Morrow was useless. You either trusted him or got out of his way. As the orders spread through the camp, the mood shifted. Victory hung in the air, but it was fragile, like thin glass ready to crack. Soldiers laughed softly as they smoked together, telling stories about the ambush, exaggerating kills, naming dead enemies with mock ceremony. But under it all was tension. They had survived something massive, and they all knew the storm wasn't over. Back at the command tent, Morrow unrolled another map. This time he didn't just look at terrain. He looked at the bigger picture. Troop movements, supply lines, the direction the war was turning. The Germans were desperate. They were losing ground in France. The Eastern Front was collapsing. They needed a win here, and that meant they'd throw everything they had at this region. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, now cold, and stared at the flickering lantern beside him. Then footsteps. Lieutenant Marta Bell entered, her sleeves rolled up, face streaked with oil from helping with the field radios. She was sharp, quiet, and perhaps the only person who spoke to Morrow like an equal. "They've found our pattern," she said. "Our fake signals. They know we're trying to mislead them." Morrow took a slow sip and said, "Good. That means we give them new signals. Real ones this time. That still look fake." Marta raised an eyebrow. "You're going to tell them exactly where we're going?" "I'm going to tell them exactly where we're not," he replied. Silence hung for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. "You really are crazy." Morrow smiled again. "That's the idea." By midnight, the troops were packing up. Wounded were stabilized and lifted onto wagons and trucks. Artillery crews dismantled their guns with speed and discipline. Every movement was rehearsed, silent, clean. There would be no second ambush. This time they were ghosts. But somewhere in the trees beyond the valley, shadows moved. The Germans were watching now, learning, adapting. The next strike wouldn't come with overconfidence. It would come with rage, with vengeance. And Elias Morrow knew it. He stood one last time at the edge of the battlefield and whispered, "Now let's see if madness can strike twice." 20th of September 1944. Just before dawn, rain began to fall. Soft at first, then heavier, soaking through uniforms, drenching boots, turning the forest trails into mud-slick paths that clung to every step like regret. The silence of the night was broken only by the low hum of truck engines and the distant thud of artillery. Far enough not to be immediate, close enough to remind everyone that death wasn't far behind. General Elias Morrow stood atop a ridge as the last of his men filtered out of the Karsfeld Valley. The burning wreckage of the previous day's ambush still smoldered behind them, glowing faintly like dying embers in a battlefield that had become their trap, and now their graveyard to leave behind. The 29th Infantry, once counted out and considered lost, had slipped away under the cover of night. But the Germans were no longer fooled. At 2:40 hours, a scout returned, face pale, uniform torn, one arm pressed tightly to his bleeding ribs. He had seen them, hundreds, maybe thousands. Armor, infantry, supply trucks, all coming in fast from the east. The counter-offensive had begun. "They're closing in. 12 hours, maybe less," he said through gritted teeth before collapsing. Captain Royce stepped beside Morrow, water dripping off the rim of his helmet. "They're going to throw the hammer now, sir." "And we're running out of places to dodge it." Morrow didn't answer right away. He just stared down the muddy path that led into the next valley, smaller than Karsfeld, narrower, more dangerous. It was called Grönthal Pass, and on any other day it would be considered suicide to march troops through it under threat of pursuit. Too narrow, too exposed. But tomorrow it was something else entirely. He knelt, scooped a handful of mud in his bare hand, and stared at it like it held secrets. Then he stood, eyes blazing. "We lure them into Grönthal," he said quietly. "We don't run. We slow down. Just enough to keep them interested." Royce blinked. "You want to bait them again?" "They're angry now," Morrow said, "which makes them stupid. Stupid men follow faster, and fast men miss the traps." By mid-morning, the column moved into the pass. The cliffs on both sides were high, jagged, and wet from the rain. Soldiers glanced up often, nervous, hands gripping their rifles tight. Everyone felt it, the pressure, the tension, like a wire stretched too tight. Morrow moved ahead on horseback, his presence alone like a signal flare to the troops. Whenever he rode past, soldiers straightened up. Some nodded, some whispered, one even made the sign of the cross. Behind them, Marta Bell and her comms unit set up near an abandoned church just outside the pass entrance. There, using salvaged German radios, they sent out a fresh string of signals, authentic enough to be believed, but not too easy to decode. "This is bait," she reminded her team. "Don't get fancy. Just real enough to be trusted. Just wrong enough to kill." Meanwhile, engineers and sappers moved with eerie silence through the cliffs above. They placed explosives under rock overhangs, buried wires under wet soil, and positioned crude but effective traps where any advancing unit would least expect them. The valley wasn't just a pass anymore. It was a fuse waiting to be lit. As the day dragged on, tension rose. No gunfire, no movement, only the sound of distant tank engines growing louder. Then came the first shot. A sniper's bullet rang out, striking one of Morrow's rear guards. It was followed by a burst of machine gun fire. Then mortar shells started dropping, clumsy, scattered, but getting closer. The Germans had arrived. They weren't charging this time. They were cautious now, testing the edges, sending scouts first, like spiders feeling for a web. But that was part of Morrow's plan too. By nightfall, the 29th Infantry was fully inside Grönthal Pass. The Germans were just behind, one division, maybe two, crawling forward under the belief that they had the Americans trapped in a narrow valley. But they were wrong. Morrow sat in the cold darkness, his fingers wrapped around a metal detonator box, listening to the rain drum on the rocks above. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just waited. And in the cliffs, the wires glowed. September 1944, 03:41 a.m. The night was black and wet. Rain poured in sheets now, loud enough to drown out even footsteps. Visibility had dropped to near zero inside Grönthal Pass, the narrow gorge where General Elias Morrow had led his men not to escape, but to set the stage for something far bloodier. German soldiers advanced slowly, careful this time, inching forward under the belief they had cornered a broken American unit. Their commanders were no longer underestimating Morrow. The ambush at Karsfeld had taught them something dangerous. This general wasn't just mad. He was methodical. Still, they believed they had him now. They believed he had nowhere left to run. But as they moved deeper into the pass, none of them noticed how quiet it had become. The wind had died. The birds were gone. Even the rain seemed to fall slower here, like time itself was holding its breath. And above them, scattered across the cliffs and rocks, sat buried wires, stacked charges, and hidden barrels, filled with fuel and fire. General Morrow stood in a small cave on the south ridge, overlooking the valley. His uniform was soaked, his boots caked in red mud. But he wasn't trembling. He was calm, too calm. In front of him sat the detonator, a simple metal box, cold to the touch, wired directly into the network of explosives his engineers had spent the last 2 nights burying into the very bones of the Untold cliffs. Beside him, Marta Bell adjusted her headset, listening to the scratchy signals coming in from the scouts still watching the pass entrance. "They're almost all in," she whispered. "2 full divisions minimum. Looks like they've got armor support behind them." Morrow didn't answer right away. He simply stared into the darkness. The outlines of enemy flashlights flickered below, faint, moving like ghosts. He could almost hear their boots, almost smell their breath. He remembered something his grandfather once told him during a hunting trip when he was 12. "You don't kill the wolf while he's running. You kill him when he thinks you're weak." He clenched his fist. "How many of our boys made it past the ridgeline?" he finally asked. Marta looked down at her notepad. "All but 23. Those stayed behind for trap duty. Volunteers." Morrow's jaw tightened. He knew what trap duty meant. The ones who stayed behind would likely never leave. "They knew the risks," Marta said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "Doesn't make it easier," he muttered. A static buzz burst through the comms. A young scout's voice came in, low and shaky. "Eagle's Nest to Black Dog. Full pack is inside. I repeat, the wolves are inside the den. God help us." Morrow nodded once, slowly. Then he placed a hand on the detonator. He didn't shout. He didn't give a speech. He just pressed the button. The valley exploded. It wasn't a single blast. It was dozens, timed, layered, overlapping in a wave of fire and rock and sound that turned night into day for 10 horrifying seconds. The cliffs erupted inward, burying the forward armor. Fire rolled down the sides of the gorge, fed by gasoline-soaked traps. Boulders the size of trucks were blasted loose, crushing anything below. And then came the secondary explosions. German ammo carts, fuel tanks, mortars, cooking off all at once in a chain reaction that turned the entire pass into a furnace. Men screamed. Radios went silent. Vehicles burned. The Grunthal Pass, once just a narrow stretch of land, became a tomb. From the cliff above, Morrow and his command team watched as smoke and fire twisted upward into the rain. The rocks below glowed red. The air stank of burning oil, gunpowder, and death. Captain Royce arrived, his face pale, eyes wide. "Jesus," he whispered. "You just buried 2 divisions alive." Morrow didn't flinch. "I told them," he said, voice low. "Madness works." He turned away, rain still falling on his back, and muttered, almost to himself, "But God help me if this is what it takes to win." Far behind them, the rest of the 29th Infantry was already on the move, heading west toward the next valley, the next fight. Word would spread quickly, not just among allies, but among enemies. The Americans had a general who didn't follow rules, who didn't retreat to survive, he retreated to kill. And the name Elias Morrow would soon echo across both fronts like a warning. Don't chase the mad dog. He bites back. To Friday, 21st September 1944. 7:22 m. The smoke from Grunthal still rose behind them, thick and black against the grey morning sky. It drifted like a funeral shroud across the hills as General Morrow's men marched westward, silent, grim, and soaked to the bone. The air stank of burning steel, flesh, and scorched earth. Some soldiers didn't look back. Others did, pausing just for a moment to glance at the wreckage they had left behind. They had won, but it didn't feel like victory. Captain Royce trudged beside Morrow, his boots squelching in the mud. He hadn't spoken for over an hour. The adrenaline had drained from him, and now there was only exhaustion and questions. "How many do you think survived down there?" he finally asked. Morrow didn't turn his head. He just said, "Too few to matter." "And our 23 men? The ones we left to light the fuse?" Morrow's jaw tightened. "We don't count ghosts when there are still living to save." Royce wanted to say more. He wanted to scream, even accuse. But he didn't, because deep down he knew Morrow was right. And that's what made it worse. They walked in silence until they reached the edge of a half-destroyed village, Rosenthal. It had been abandoned weeks ago, its people fleeing before the German advance. Now the windows stared blankly, doors swaying in the wind, chickens clucking wildly in empty yards like nothing had changed. The column stopped to rest. Men collapsed against walls and under trees, stripping off wet jackets, cleaning weapons with numb hands. The wounded were laid down in what had once been a bakery, now reeking of rot and damp flour. Marta Bell set up her communications gear inside an old schoolhouse, wiring the radio through broken windows, her fingers moving with practiced urgency. Morrow stood in what remained of the village church, roof blown out, pews splintered. He walked slowly to the altar, now nothing but a charred stump, and sat down. For the first time in 3 days, he let his shoulders drop. He felt every death, every young face he couldn't name, every scream that had echoed through the rocks of Grönthal. Victory meant nothing to him anymore. It hadn't for a long time. Then came the boy, 12, maybe 13. Dirt on his face, a coat 2 sizes too big, shoes with holes. He stepped into the church with a rifle slung awkwardly over his back. Eyes wide, full of something Morrow hadn't seen in a while. Awe. "You're the mad general," the boy said, voice barely a whisper. Morrow looked up surprised. "Who told you that?" "Everyone," the boy said. "The Germans say you don't retreat. You pretend to run. Then you kill. They say you're not a soldier. They say you're a ghost." Morrow let out a dry laugh. "A ghost, huh?" The boy stepped closer. "I want to fight. You should be hiding," Morrow replied. "There's nowhere left to hide," the boy said, eyes steady. "But I can shoot. I shot one of them last week. He was taking my sister." The air went still. Morrow looked at the boy for a long time. He didn't speak. Then finally he stood, walked over, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You'll fight," he said softly, "but not with rage. With reason. And when the time is right." He turned to Royce, who had been standing quietly by the door. "Get him food. And boots," Royce nodded. Outside, word was spreading fast. Scouts had returned with intercepted German chatter. 2 more divisions had been rerouted away from the front to deal with Morrow's ghost army. Commanders were panicking. Supply lines were shifting. Whole regiments were slowing their advance, scared of walking into another trap. But Morrow had no intention of repeating himself. That was the key, unpredictability. Keep them guessing. Keep them scared. That afternoon, he gathered his officers in the church, using the altar as a table. Maps were spread out, lit by oil lamps. New paths, new strategies. They were no longer just surviving. They were hunting. "Gentlemen," Morrow said, tapping a point west of their current location, "we take the fight to them now. We don't wait. We don't run. We bleed them before they even find us." Royce narrowed his eyes. "Another ambush?" Morrow shook his head slowly. "Something worse, because madness was just getting started." September 1944, 01:13 a.m. The sky was pitch black again, and the rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a thick fog that rolled like smoke across the countryside. Somewhere in the distance a lone dog barked once, then silence. It was the kind of night where even the moon seemed afraid to look down. General Elias Morrow stood over a fresh fire, surrounded by a small group of hand-picked soldiers. These weren't regular infantry. These were the ghosts within the ghost army. The ones who didn't ask questions, who didn't blink when told to do the impossible. Black ops, saboteurs, snipers and scouts, all under Morrow's direct command now. He called them the Strays, not because they were lost, but because no one had claimed them, except him. A young corporal, face covered in ash and paint, unfolded a map and laid it on the wet grass. "This is the new target," she said. "The Germans are using this rail hub outside Marienburg as a central artery. Ammo, fuel, reinforcements, all funneled through there." Morrow studied the map with cold intensity. "Guard numbers? High, 2 companies minimum. Tanks, artillery, but they're not expecting direct contact this deep behind their own lines." That was exactly the point. He traced a finger across the map, calculating distance, terrain, and time. "We hit it tonight." Captain Royce, who had been silent since arriving, finally spoke. "Sir, we just pulled off 2 miracle ambushes. The men are dead on their feet. They need sleep." "Hell, you need sleep." Morrow looked at him with an expression that could cut through steel. "If we rest now, we give them time to regroup, to rearm. I don't want to fight those same divisions again in 3 days. I want to make sure they never fight again." Royce didn't argue. He just nodded, lips tight. The strays moved like shadows. By 0200 hours, they had already slipped through 2 enemy outposts without a single sound. No gunfire, no alarms, just whispers in the dark, the soft crunch of boots on grass, and the click of knives unsheathing when necessary. Morrow led from the front, as always, not barking orders from the rear, but crawling through mud beside the youngest soldier in the squad. His presence was steady, strange, even comforting in a twisted way. He didn't feel like a general. He felt like a ghost who refused to die. At 0257, they reached the edge of the Marienburg rail yard. Rows of fuel tankers sat motionless on the tracks. German trucks idled nearby, their engines humming low. Lanterns flickered along the fence line, casting long shadows. A dozen soldiers patrolled lazily, bored, overconfident. They had no idea they were being watched. Morrow knelt behind a broken wall and glanced to his left. 2 snipers were already in position. To his right, the demolitions team waited with a crate of sticky bombs and wired charges. He whispered, 2 minutes, no second chances. And like that, the ghosts slipped into the yard. Silence was their weapon. One guard vanished without a sound. A blade pulled across his throat. Another went down with a muffled thud. Before the rest could react, the explosions began, but not from the charges. No, that was the distraction. A single grenade lobbed at the far end of the yard, drawing the Germans toward it, like moths to flame. Then the real attack. Sticky bombs slammed onto fuel tankers. Time charges stuck beneath trucks. Sniper rounds dropped officers where they stood. Within seconds, the entire depot was chaos, and the strays melted away into the night like smoke on the wind. At 0312, the sky behind them turned orange. A deafening boom rocked the earth. Fire ripped through the rail yard. One tanker igniting the next in a chain reaction so violent it shattered windows a mile away. The Germans never had a chance. Back in Rosenthal, the ground trembled beneath the boots of the 29th. Soldiers stared westward, eyes wide, faces lit orange by distant flames. Royce stood outside the church, watching the inferno on the horizon. "That has to be Morrow," he muttered. "Who else would light the damn sky on fire just to send a message?" Inside the church, the boy Morrow had met sat cleaning his new boots. When someone asked him if he was scared of dying, he simply shrugged. "The general says fear is for men who don't fight smart." By morning, radio chatter across the German Fifth Army was pure panic. The Americans weren't retreating, they were hunting. Utei Sanger September 1944, 0744. Smoke still clung to the sky like a dirty curtain when General Elias Morrow returned to Rosenthal. His uniform was scorched at the collar. His gloves were black with soot. But he walked with the same calm stride, unbothered by the firestorm they'd just unleashed. Soldiers stepped aside as he passed, not out of fear, but out of something deeper. Reverence, the kind reserved for men who didn't just survive war, but bent it. Captain Royce met him outside the bakery, where the wounded were still being treated. His face was tired, eyes bloodshot, but there was a quiet smirk behind his usual disapproval. "So, just a quick strike, huh?" Morrow took a flask from his coat and drank deep. 2 ammo trains, fuel depots, 8 transports, 1 radio station. That's what I call quick. You lit up half the goddamn sky. That was the point. They walked together toward the command post, ducking beneath collapsed beams and charred walls. The village wasn't safe. Morrow knew that. They couldn't stay long. Not with the Germans scrambling to regain control. Every hour bought by last night's fire would be followed by blood. He was sure of it. Inside the schoolhouse, Marta Bell was already working the radios. Her headphones sat askew, one side lifted so she could still hear the room. She glanced up as Morrow entered. "They're losing their minds out there," she said, sliding over a handwritten report. "Intercepted chatter says Marienburg Rail Hub was their primary artery. They've rerouted supply to a longer path. Slower, more vulnerable." Morrow nodded slowly. "Then we bleed them on that path next." She hesitated, then added, "There's more. Command has finally noticed." Royce raised an eyebrow. "High Command?" "Higher," Marta said, her voice quieter now. "London." That got Morrow's attention. What do they want? He asked. To know if the stories are true. About you, about us. About this ghost division that was supposed to be dead, Royce chuckled. They think we're dead? Until yesterday, they assumed we were either captured, dissolved, or scattered. Then came Grönthal. Now Marienburg. And now, she tapped the map, they're listening. Morrow turned away and stared out the window. The fog had lifted slightly, and in the distance a new sun struggled to rise behind the ash. We're not ghosts, he muttered. We're smoke, and we go where the fire's going next. The door creaked open behind them. A messenger burst in, breathless, a smear of blood on his cheek, not his own. Sir, he gasped. German armor. South of Rosenthal. Looks like a full mechanized division. They're moving fast, and they're not probing anymore. They're hunting, Morrow turned calmly. ETA? 6 hours, maybe less. We've got scouts watching them, but we can't slow them. Not this time. For the first time since Karsfeld, a chill passed through the room. Even Royce's smirk vanished. A full mechanized division meant tanks, half-tracks, flamethrowers, and the kind of firepower that crushed villages like Rosenthal in under an hour. Marta looked at Morrow. If we run now, we make it out. He shook his head. No, that's what they expect. We already ran twice. Royce narrowed his eyes. Then what? We stay and fight a division with a wounded skeleton crew and scorched weapons. Morrow leaned over the map, his finger tapping a ridge south of Rosenthal. There's an old coal mine here. Deep shafts. Wooden beams. One way in, one way out. You're not thinking, Royce began. I'm not thinking, Morrow cut in. I'm deciding. He looked at them all. We don't fight them here. We drag them into the mine. We give them the illusion of collapse, of retreat. Let them roll in, convinced they've cornered the Ghost Division one last time. Marta stared at him. And then we bury them in the dark. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the crackle of the radio seemed to hold its breath. Royce nodded slowly. We'll need charges, rations, an exit plan. There won't be an exit plan, Morrow said flatly. Not for everyone. He turned, picked up his rifle and slung it over his shoulder. Tell the men. 6 hours. As he stepped outside, the young boy from the church, the one who'd begged to fight, stood waiting, rifle across his chest, boots polished, eyes wide. You still want to fight? Morrow asked. The boy nodded. Good, Morrow said, because the dark's coming, and we're going to meet it head-on. To see, September 1944, 12:33 p.m. The old coal mine stood like a scar carved into the side of a forgotten hill. Rotted wooden supports, rusted carts, a sign half buried in dirt that read, Betreten verboten, entry forbidden. The Germans had abandoned it months ago, after a collapse killed 24 miners. Locals avoided it like a curse, which made it the perfect place for Elias Morrow's next piece of madness. The 29th Infantry moved fast and quiet, every man trained now to carry silence like a weapon. Inside the dark shaft, engineers laid down explosives along the main tunnel supports, stringing wires through rotting beams like spiders weaving death. Further inside, narrow escape paths were scouted, mapped, marked with red chalk. The place was a tomb, and they were turning it into a coffin. General Morrow stood at the entrance, surveying the setup as Captain Royce approached from the tree line. They bought it, Royce said, panting slightly. Our scouts fired a few shots near the old village. Germans thought it was a rear guard. They're moving north, straight toward us. Full division, armor, infantry, scouts. Morrow nodded. Good. How long until they reach the mine? Less than 2 hours. But we've got another problem. He handed Morrow a small folded paper. London's calling again. They know about Marienburg. Now they're demanding answers. They want to send reinforcements. They want you to report in. Morrow crumpled the message without reading it. We don't have time for politics. They're saying they'll cut off support if you don't respond. Let them. He turned back toward the mine. Support never saved us before. Inside the shaft, the temperature dropped. The deeper they went, the more it felt like walking into the mouth of something ancient and angry. Lanterns were lit sparingly. The miners had left behind their tools, their memories, and the kind of silence that seemed to hum in your bones. Marta Bell moved through the tunnels like she'd lived here all her life. Her hands checked wires, marked positions, adjusted charges with cold precision. She found Morrow near the central chamber, the heart of the mine, where two corridors intersected into a dead-end trap. "It's ready," she said. Morrow crouched beside one of the detonators. "When they enter, give them 5 minutes. Let them feel safe. Let them push forward, cocky, confident, and then collapse the main shaft." "No," he looked up at her, eyes hard. "We collapse all of it. The shaft, the escape tunnels, the surface entrances. We bury them with so much rock, they'll think the earth itself spit them out." Marta stared at him. "You do know this plan leaves us inside. We'll crawl out the old ventilation shaft, the narrow one." She frowned. "That shaft is a death sentence. It's vertical, 100 feet deep. One rope. I've climbed worse," Morrow said. Marta didn't argue. She knew by now there was no changing him, only surviving him. At 2:09 p.m., the Germans arrived. Tanks rumbled through the trees, pushing broken carts aside like toys. Infantry fanned out, cautious but confident. Scouts led the way, guns raised, calling out in clipped commands. They saw the trail of boot prints, saw the faint glow of lanterns inside. They thought it was desperation. They thought the Americans had finally run out of land. "Advance and finish them," one officer shouted. The Germans entered the mine in force, 50, then 100, then more. They were noisy, careless. Their radios crackled, voices loud with victory. But they didn't realize the earth was listening. At 2:21 p.m., Morrow gave the signal. A red flare fired from inside the chamber. Marta hit the detonator. The mine didn't just collapse, it screamed. Explosions tore through support beams, sending tons of rock crashing down like thunder. Dust shot from the entrance like cannon fire. Flames roared through the shaft as fuel reserves ignited, sucking the oxygen from the tunnels. Outside, the ground shook. Trees swayed. Birds took to the sky in a panic. And silence fell. Roy stood at the tree line, mouth slightly open. "Dear God!" He buried an entire division in one breath. Inside, under the rubble, Morrow and a dozen others scrambled toward the narrow ventilation shaft. Smoke burned their lungs. Dust blinded them. Men coughed blood, but Morrow just kept climbing, hand over hand, finger by finger, every inch earned in pain. Because madness wasn't just a strategy. It was survival.